Coming to you entirely pre-recorded from the Garage of Solitude here in Whitestone, Queens, I am Mario-Francisco Robles, and this is episode 14 of the Superman on Film podcast. Hi, everybody. Welcome to the show. I'm very much looking forward to today's topic. This is one of the topics that when I was putting this show together in my head many moons ago, this idea of a Superman on Film centric podcast, one of the very first topics I was excited to delve into was the original plans for Superman 1 and 2. Because, over the last 10 years, almost everything having to do with Superman in cinema has been somehow marred in controversy. And the modern day fan might think that this is all new, that this is all just part of the current Warner Brothers bureaucracy. And this is just, in the modern day development hell of things. Many fans may think that Superman's controversial, tumultuous times are all in the modern day. But in actuality, if you go back to Superman's 1 and 2 and director Richard Donner's clashes with the Salkinds, the producers on those two films, and all the crazy behind the scenes machinations that went into splitting those movies into two different things and bringing in another director to complete the second one, and how that meant Donner left despite him having other places he wanted to go with Superman. It's a fascinating story in and of itself. So I'm very happy to be finally delving into those. But as always, before we get into today's retrospective topic, let's talk about what's going on in the present day, because we are currently at 33 weeks from James Gunn's Superman. That's right. We are 33 weeks away. When I started this podcast, we were 52 weeks away. So we're getting very close to the halfway point here. And as such, interesting little tidbits and little rumors are starting to make their way out our way. And I'm going to get to those in just a moment. But first, since we are 33 weeks away, I want each of you to put a date on your radar. All right. I want you to put the date, because we all think about July 11th, 2025, but I want you to start thinking already about what you're going to be doing on July 12th, 2025, the Saturday, the day after the film comes out, because obviously you will have seen the movie by July 12th. If you're like me, you're going to see it opening night. You probably will have even gone Thursday night, the night before, for a Thursday preview performance. And if you're really like me, hopefully you're going to get invited to a press screening at some point too. So by the time July 12th comes, you probably will have seen the film at least once. But if you are in the New York tri-state area or are in the mood to travel, feel free to join me here in New York City on July 12th, 2025 for the official Superman on Film watch party for James Gunn's Superman. All right? I want you to come see James Gunn's Superman with me. Now, for those of you who are newer listeners and newer followers, I used to do this all the time when I was running RevengeOfTheFans.com. We would have Revenger watch parties, and we went to go see everything from Avengers Infinity War to Captain Marvel to Justice League to Aquaman to all kinds of things, and it was really fun. It used to be great to just get a bunch of like-minded fans together, go see the movie, and then go hash it out afterward, have a conversation in the lobby afterward, or find a bar nearby, and let's break open this movie and basically have like a live podcast, just kind of discussing what we just experienced, how it measured up to our expectations, what rumors we had reported on and discussed along the way actually made it to the big screen, and which things seemed to be a big lie that a lot of us fell for. It always just tends to be a very fun night out. So if you are in the New York tri-state area and you would like to travel to see this film with me, July 12th, 2025, stay tuned. I'll be releasing more details as we get closer on the location, on the cost of the tickets, on all that kind of good stuff. But yes, just put that date on your calendar, July 12th, 2025. If you live anywhere near me, I would love to see James Gunn's Superman with you. But now, let's go ahead and get into this week's Superman on Film update. By the way, nobody told me where they think this song is from. The news jingle for this podcast. If you think you know, send me an email at supermanonfilm@gmail.com, or find me on any of the different social media outlets out there, whether it's Threads or Blue Sky or X or Facebook. You could find Superman on Film. So feel free, if you have figured out what that news jingle is, I want to see who the first person to get it right is. But okay, so let's get into this week's interesting thing. So last week I was discussing with you that it looks like the trailer for the film is in fact complete, but now comes a fairly concrete rumor from Collider that the trailer for Superman will be arriving at some point in December, possibly linked to Disney's Mufasa, which is funny because, Mufasa wasn't really on my radar, and I kind of thought, who cares? But apparently it is tracking to have a huge opening weekend, because that's just how Disney does it. Families somehow hear, oh, there's a new Disney tentpole, we got to go check it out. Even though it looks like it's just a derivative spin-off, a cash grab of The Lion King, apparently a lot of people will be racing out to see Mufasa in December. And as such, Warner Brothers has decided this would be the right blockbuster to put the Superman trailer in front of, so that throughout the entire holiday season, as this smash hit movie is in theaters, all the audiences who are going to be going there fueling that movie to a $1 billion plus box office run, all those audiences will also be getting their first look at James Gunn's Superman, and as such be getting introduced to the general idea of the brand new DCU, this fresh start, this brand new reboot, reset for everything we know for DC on film as we know it. So that seems to be a credible rumor that mid-December, along with Mufasa, we will at last be getting our first look at the trailer. And it's interesting because there's one actor who claims to have already seen the trailer, or at least some of it, as he put it. And that actor is Frank Grillo. We know that he's playing Rick Flag Sr., the father of Joel Kinnaman's character. Flag was in both Suicide Squad and The Suicide Squad, and we know he was killed off in The Suicide Squad. And now we're going to meet his father, who may or may not want some revenge for what happened to his boy. Well, Frank Grillo has already been confirmed to appear in not only Creature Commandos, but also in Superman and in Peacemaker Season 2. So Frank Grillo's kind of, gotten the lay of the land of the DCU, if you will. And he's also known and worked with James Gunn on and off for many years. So he's got some special privileges. Let's just put it that way. And in a interview with Collider, with Frosty, with Steven Weintraub, he had the following to say about what he saw and how he felt about it.
I'll tell you something. I hope I don't get in trouble for this. I got a sneak peek at the little bit of the trailer, and I'm not joking, and I'm not blowing this out of proportion. My skin was hot and I had goosebumps. That's how great it is. And so I think, by the way, this kid David is going to be a superstar, and he's amazing, as is the rest of the cast in the film, and just James' take on it. I think I think it's going to be the movie.
I love that. I hope so too, Frank. I hope it is going to be the movie. I love that he showed his arm with the goosebumps, which is something I've done here on this show. Sometimes when talking about Superman, I just can't help but get a little emotionally overwhelmed. And the fact that Mr. Grillo felt the same way just watching the trailer, that's pretty incredible. And the way he feels about David, I hope we all feel that way. It all looks like we're about to get an extraordinary Superman performance from Mr. Corin Sweat. But I hope we all agree with Mr. Grillo that he is just a superstar. He is it. He is the thing. But if that doesn't start getting you hyped for this trailer, I don't know what will. And you know what? Aside from apparently showing off bits of the trailer to people, Gunn has been flat out screening the movie. That's right. The other day on social media, he revealed that he was in LA after a screening of his Superman movie. So I don't imagine the effects are completed yet. And this is probably a work in progress edition of the film, but he's already screening it. So that implies a certain level of confidence. That implies a certain level of, we are prepared, and this, our movie is ready to start seeing the light of day. And I don't know about you, but that's very exciting. And also, Gunn has also been discussing, what he might be working on next, because it's interesting with all of these different projects coming out of DC Studios. Some of them animated, some of them live action, some of them an unannounced video game or two. There's a lot of different things going on, and people wonder, where is James going to throw his efforts next? Because so far he's kind of been everywhere, right? He wrote and directed Superman. He wrote and was heavily involved with Creature Commandos. He wrote and directed certain episodes of Peacemaker season 2. Like, he's kind of everywhere, as well as developing all these upcoming projects. So people have rightfully been asking, well, what's going to be next for you? Where do you see yourself throwing your energy next? And here's what he said. Let me put the quote up here for you. He said, I've got like 4 different things that I could do, and I'm going to kind of jump back and forth between those things. I'm going to see which one really speaks to me, and that's the one I'm going to do. Because, that seems to be a running thing for Mr. James Gunn. He has to really feel it. He doesn't want to just be a director for hire, a hired gun who comes on and just works on something that maybe means absolutely nothing to him. No, he wants to work on projects that speak to his imagination, that speak to his heart, and speak to his particular set of skills that he thinks he could properly bring to life. And, it's interesting because I haven't offered many updates on how the DCU itself is coming together here on the show. So let's talk about what some of these projects are and how much Gunn has already been able to accomplish with just 2 years in the position, in the role of the co-head of DC Studios. Because it's interesting. It's at a certain point in all of this, it felt like everything was in the distant future, that we were going to finally get to see what he's working on. But now it's right around the corner. So let's talk about what's next for the DCU and what he's done these 2 years. Because look, we've got Creature Commandos, which, as of this recording, we are only about 11 days from the arrival of Creature Commandos, which in essence means the arrival of the DCU as we know it. So that is only 11 days away. But then we know that the next thing coming out is in July, and that's Superman. Since then, James Gunn has revealed that Peacemaker Season 2 will come out shortly after Superman, and chronologically, that's also the order it should be. Peacemaker takes place after the events of Superman the movie. Then we know that Supergirl is coming out in June of 2026, and we know that that same year, apparently, is when Lanterns will be coming out. So we know that there are already 5 different DCU projects in some semblance of releasability or production that are currently happening. And then there's also rumors that the Authority, which is another one of the projects that we know Gunn is very excited about, there's rumors that it's going to be redeveloped as an animation project, which would be interesting. It'll save on the budget, and it would maybe make it more in line with Creature Commandos and things of that nature. Who knows? Gunn has not yet commented on that, other than to say, a simple reminder: don't believe anything you read or hear about DC unless it comes from DC Studios itself, myself, James Gunn, or my partner, Peter Safran. He once again just kind of put that out there. So we do have to take everything we hear with a grain of salt. But apparently, the Authority could be getting redeveloped. It may, and whether it's animated or live action, it's also in contention for being one of the things Gunn is going to do next. But it is pretty interesting that, yes, he mentioned a whole mess of projects, and he's already made clear that nothing is going to go beyond the announcement stage. Nothing's going to get the green light and actually enter production until the scripts are ready. He's very, very stubborn about that. He's seen Hollywood's folly with sending films into production with half-finished scripts and thinking we're going to figure it out later and we're going to fix it all in post. Like, he's like, no, the movie begins on the page. We will not enter production until everything on the page is something we're excited about, and it is a completely fleshed out idea, not just a concept of a plan. But, so yeah, who knows where he's going to end up next, but the DCU is moving and shaking, and there's a lot of interesting projects that are already on the way, that have gotten the green light, that are being cast. He also dropped a hint that Paradise Lost, the series about Wonder Woman's home island, is also in very active development. So, there's going to be more announcements as these projects start to drop, and hopefully they're very successful projects. But one other thing I want to hit up on is, there's concern that with this big slate of projects that are coming, that Gunn has been fairly vocal about not doing origin stories. And people have been worried about, how can you do all these films and all these characters without introducing to the audience who they really are? Well, what's interesting is James kind of clarified things this week, that it's really only Superman and Batman who are getting that treatment in this new DCU. Because when asked why he's not telling their origin stories, he essentially said, because everyone already knows them. And then when other fans said, well, that may be true for certain characters, but not for all of them, James clarified, well, I'm only talking about Superman and Batman. So that means that all of this fuss, all of this concern people are having about the lack of origin stories, and people worrying that audiences aren't going to understand who all these characters that that Gunn is throwing at them are, he's actually clarifying, no, it's only really those two where he's going to gloss over the origins. And that tells me, he's going to find ways to tackle the other origins. Because like with Supergirl, right? It's a story that delves right into a world where Supergirl already exists and she's a fully formed character. But if you've read Supergirl, Woman of Tomorrow, you know that one of the later issues in that run, one of the, I want to say it's either, chapter 7 or chapter 10, somewhere around there, there's an entire part of it that's like one long flashback to Supergirl's origin story. So I imagine they're going to find a way to incorporate that same idea into the movie, where we're going to meet her fully formed, but at a certain point, something in the story is going to trigger a flashback, and we're going to get to see the bullet points of how she came to be Supergirl and why she is the way that she is. And that also heavily implies that this Lantern series that we know is coming to Max, starring Kyle Chandler and, what's his name? Aaron Pierre, I think, as Jon Stewart. Even though that looks like they were going to skip an origin, if James Gunn is to be believed, maybe that means that we will see Hal Jordan's origin in this series, maybe in flashback form. Maybe like lots of TV series lately like to do, where certain episodes are entirely based on one character's subplot, or it's one long flashback that's going to add gravitas and heft to what's going on in the present day of the story. But it seems like we're not going to leave Hal Jordan hanging. If Gunn is honest here, that the only people he's skipping origin stories for are Superman and Batman, that tells me that we are going to see Hal Jordan's origin in Lanterns, and maybe Lanterns itself is low-key an origin story for the Jon Stewart Green Lantern. You know what I mean? We're gonna have the older Lantern teaching this new guy the ropes. So it's an origin story for the new guy, but at a certain point, we're gonna find out how the veteran got involved with all this stuff. That's just how that's how I'm interpreting Gunn's words here on his concepts for how an origin story works or doesn't. So for those of you out there who were a little nervous about Gunn's stance on origin stories and the fact that Superman isn't really going to delve into one, and that we're going to meet a Batman that's also just a fully formed Batman about to meet his new Robin, and we're not going to go into all the different years of adventures and misadventures that this Bruce Wayne has gone through. We're going to hit the ground running. Apparently, it really is just the world's finest who are getting this treatment. Apparently, all the other major characters, as needed, are going to have their origins represented. So I think that should put a few minds at ease. What do you think? All right, so let's do it. Let's get to this week's topic, the original plans for Donner's Superman 1, 2, and beyond. Because it's very interesting. There are some modern day movie making techniques that at the time seemed revolutionary in the late 90s and early 2000s when they were going on. But actually, it was not the first time these things had been attempted. And what I'm referring to is this idea of making one long production and splitting it into multiple movies. And in this particular case, it would have been 2 movies. Because famous examples of that would be something like Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings trilogy. That trilogy wasn't treated like we're going to film one movie and then release it, and then we're going to film a second movie and then release that one, and then we're going to film a third and then release that one, like most franchises do. No, that was filmed as one long, massive production that took a very long time to complete and was then cut into 3 different movies and released almost like episodically a year apart. That was a very interesting idea. And there have been other films that have done it too. There were a couple of Pirates movies that were shot that way. There have been, there have been a handful of projects that approach things that way. But actually, if you go back to 1977, that's how Superman 1 and 2 were being made. Because when Mario Puzo put together his treatment for this Superman movie, he basically had like 9 hours of story that was somehow supposed to be one movie that became 2 movies, and they found a place to split it. And, the original plan was just to make this one very long, ambitious story and have it cut in the middle with a big cliffhanger to get you excited to come back for Superman 2. That was the big idea at the time, and we're going to get into what that cliffhanger would have been, what the real ending for Superman 1 would have been, and how that affected what became of Superman 2, and how we even felt the impact of that when we watched the Donner cut of Superman 2 in 2006. We're going to go through everything soup to nuts, but real quick, just a little bit of a history lesson, right? It was a very different time back then in the 70s, because you see, Warner Brothers was barely involved with the making of this Superman movie, which is crazy to think, right? Nowadays, we think of Warner Brothers as this studio that's been very involved with the crafting of Superman and often gives the wrong notes and has made a whole bunch of ridiculous decisions regarding Superman. But we think of Superman is a WB thing, because WB owns DC and therefore owns Superman, and they've been able to sort of get their fingers all up in everything related to Superman forever. And yet, in the 70s, when these films were getting made, Warner Brothers was not really involved at all with the making of it. They were only the distributing wing, which is kind of funny, because that's kind of what they are now. Now that DC Studios exists and James Gunn and Peter Safran have siloed off DC and all these characters away from Warner Brothers Pictures, now Warner Brothers Pictures is literally just the distribution wing. They're going to help promote the movie, get the movie out there, but they're not actually involved in the production of the film itself, and therefore they can't give notes that must be taken. They can't make any sweeping changes to the film. They are just the distributors. That's how it is today, and that's how it was in the 70s when these films were getting made. The actual power brokers were not Warner Brothers people. It was Alex and Ilya Salkind. This whole project and that whole run of Christopher Reeve movies, that was their baby. And in essence, they got Warner Brothers to sign off on letting them make it their way, and they just distribute it. I would love to, at some point, find out how they were able to pull that off, how they convinced Warner Brothers to, hey, even though you've owned Superman since before we wanted to make this movie, just let us do what we want to do, and you don't worry about it, and you just promote and put the movie out there for us, okay? And let us, the Salkinds, do it. Like, I would love to know how they got that deal. It would have been, I don't know who okayed that. But it also speaks to perhaps how what the studio really thought of Superman at the time. Remember, superhero movies weren't a thing yet. Superheroes were still thought of as kid things. It's a way to sell toys. It's a campy, childish, cartoonish, over-the-top form of children's entertainment. So Warner Brothers was not thinking too much of Superman at the time. I'm sure that was part of how they let this happen. But regardless of the case, this was a Salkind baby. And they eventually got Richard Donner, hot off of the success of The Omen, to sign on to make their Superman movie. But almost right out of the gate, tensions started to flare because Donner didn't want to be a hired gun director, just like James Gunn. Like I was saying earlier, he wanted to believe in this. He wanted to make a movie that did Superman justice, because he did used to read Superman comics and he did watch the old show, and he had in his heart and in his mind an idea for what Superman is, could be, and what he should represent to children and to people around the world. So Donner really right away sort of took ownership of the project, and rather than go, okay, you give me the script and I will bring the script to life, he was like, no, we need to tweak this script. And as such, Donner and the writers worked together to try to craft a more cohesive story, something that was more serious, something that was more heartwarming, something that had more gravitas to it, and didn't just feel like the 1960s Adam West Batman and Robin, but with Superman and on the big screen. He wanted to make something that would really stand the test of time, tell a truthful, honest story using this icon that has meant so much to so many for so long. And when he still didn't feel like it was coming through right, that's when he brought in Tom Mankiewicz, his creative consultant, to kind of take the final pass at the film. And a lot of Tom's touches remain some of the most iconic things that ever happened when having to do with Superman. You know, he wrote a lot of the speeches of Jor-El to Kal-El, and Tom is like the underdog hero, the low-key, undersung hero of the first Superman movies. And together with Donner, they finally really cracked the code on Superman. And, we owe the two of them a huge debt of gratitude. But the Salkinds didn't look at it that way. They just thought, these Hollywood types are messing with our thing. Why can't we just have our Superman movie, have it make all this money, and we can go be rich Hollywood tycoons who made Superman movies? They didn't think it had to be that deep. They didn't understand all of the different creative reworkings, and there was clashes all throughout the production. Because, let's talk about, the original ending to Superman 1 and how, what they were trying to do at the outset. Okay. So like I said, it was going to be two movies, two stories divided by a cliffhanger. As such, the original ending for Superman the movie was going to involve the big crazy earthquake happening. Actually, no, he was going to stop the big crazy earthquake from happening. Because the ending we know about, the ending we've all seen, is an ending where Lex Luthor has depowered Superman at his underground lair with a kryptonite necklace, and he's released two warheads into the air, and one is going to destroy Hackensack, New Jersey, and one is going to destroy basically the entire West Coast. It's going to hit the San Andreas Fault and send California into the ocean, creating a new West Coast for our megalomaniacal real estate mogul Lex Luthor, played by Gene Hackman, to now be, the most powerful man in the country, and yada, yada, yada. That was the original, thing. And Superman eventually, through the help of Miss Tessmacher, he breaks out, he stops the bomb that was going to destroy Hackensack, and then he goes out west where he's too late, and that missile does hit the San Andreas Fault. It does create an insane earthquake that almost risks destroying the entire West Coast. And along the way, Lois Lane dies while Superman is there trying to reverse the effects of this. And ultimately, Superman has to break his vow to his father to not interfere in human history and reverse time to try to bring Lois back and fix this huge mistake he's made in his timing. That's the ending we know about. But the original cliffhanger ending was notably different. In the original, there were not two warheads. There was only one. And he wasn't chained in Lex Luthor's underground lair, as we saw. No, he was lured to an erupting volcano before Lex put that kryptonite necklace on him. And it's while he's there in an erupting volcano on the verge of death that Miss Tessmacher sets him free, except it's not to save her mom. It's because she realizes, whoa, Lex left and I'm going to die unless you save me. So she saves Superman selfishly for him to save her. Then he races across to try to stop the other missile, and basically he gets to it like just in time, rips the warhead off and sends it into outer space. And Superman has saved the day. And that was going to be, that was the big action climax. And then the cliffhanger was going to be that we were going to watch that warhead drift off into space and then explode. And it was going to explode, releasing Zod and Ursa and Nan from the Phantom Zone, that their little mirror thingy was going to be in the vicinity. And when this nuclear warhead goes off, it releases them. The three of them instantly realize they're close to Earth, and they start flying towards Earth, and then fade to black, to be continued in Superman 2. Like, that was the original idea. Imagine that. Imagine not having the Lois death. Imagine not having the time reversal. Like, imagine how different a film Superman the movie would have been if it ended this way. And there were lots of other interesting little touches. Like, there was originally going to be a fourth Kryptonian. There were, there were other little things that I was fascinated to discover just didn't make its way to the final cut of the movie, and in certain cases weren't even filmed. But it's just interesting to know all the different things that might and could have happened. But if this cliffhanger happens and Lois never died, now let's talk about what Superman 2 would have been. Because in Superman 2, a lot of the plot would have been relatively the same. You would still have Lois starting to realize that maybe Clark and Superman are the same person. You would still have Clark and Lois falling for each other. You would still have Superman making the decision to relinquish his powers. We would still have Zod and his forces showing up during this time and basically attempting to take over the planet, and thus Superman realizing, oh, I can't give up my powers. The Earth needs me, and the one time I let my guard down, everything almost went to hell. So I have to fix this somehow. And it was still going to have a battle in Metropolis. It was still going to have them all fighting at the Fortress of Solitude. But at the end of this one, it was going to be made very clear that Superman was depowering the Kryptonians and having them arrested and taken away, and Lex gets arrested and taken away. And essentially the dramatic resolution for Superman 2 is after Superman has saved the day, he and Lois agree that they can't be together, that their romance almost essentially caused the end of the world because the world needs Superman and he has to make that sacrifice, and she has to accept this painful decision that even though she thinks he's her everything, she has to let him go because he belongs to the world. So all of that was in there, and a lot of it played out very differently. Donner had a different way of developing the story and trying to get to the climax than Lester did, which was more comedic in approach. But the big difference was, since in Superman 1, he wouldn't have done the time travel thing. Remember, he didn't need to do that in the original plan. In the original plan, Superman saved the day in time. So now that means that here, in this moment, at the end of Superman 2, this would have been where Superman made that fateful decision to reverse time. And he would essentially, it was just going to reverse time to where things were at the end of Superman 1. It was going to bring us to a time where Lois doesn't know the secret. It was going to put the criminals back into the Phantom Zone, and Luthor will have never escaped from prison. So he was reversing time to do those things, not to save Lois's life anymore, but basically to reset the clock on everything we had seen in Superman 2. And honestly, this for me is one of the reasons why the Donner cut that we got in 2006 never worked. Because never mind the fact that the time reversal thing itself is pretty hokey. This idea that spinning the earth in reverse on its axis would reverse time. That was always a little bit kind of a hokey, strange idea to begin with. But this idea now that he did it twice, if we are to accept the Donner Cut 2 as the official cut of Superman 2, that means that in Superman 1, when he failed to save the day, he reversed time. And then again in Superman 2, after he saved the day, he's still just going to reverse time again just to kind of make everything easier on everybody. It just, that's why to me, no matter how great it was to see a film that was majorly Richard Donner's movie, since we didn't get the one that properly leads up to it, the whole thing just kind of feels like a fun, cute little what if story, a what if idea for what would have happened if everything about these first two movies was fairly different. But I'm reminded once again about interesting just parallels and how things just like there are these interesting little forks in the road over the years that come from these Superman movies that always make you wonder. Because in Superman Returns, there was a very expensive scene, a sequence called Return to Krypton that was set to open it and cost something like $10 million just to make this opening segment. And ultimately that ended up on the cutting room floor. They didn't even end up using it. And it's one of the many baffling things about Superman Returns about like there was a lot of bloat in that budget. And it just makes you wonder, like, why wasn't anyone cracking the whip over there? Why wasn't anyone paying attention or minding the mint and asking, like, if we're going to blow all this money on this sequence, we got to freaking use it. And I bring this up because that's essentially what happened with Superman 1 and 2. Because you see, Richard Donner had shot everything that would be needed for Superman 1, and he had shot like 75% of what was needed for Superman 2 when the Salkinds approached him with this idea of, why don't we rework the stories and just focus on finishing 1 now, and then we'll come back and finish what's left of Superman 2 later. All right, we'll worry about Superman 2 after the fact. For now, we've spent a ton of money. We need to get Superman 1 out so we can try to recoup costs, and then we'll use that money to make a proper Superman 2. And that's when they reworked this and brought the time travel sequence from 2 to 1. And I bring this up in conjunction with the Return to Krypton, because similar to the Return to Krypton, they had already created this sequence, the sequence of Superman turning back the Earth and the effects of him flying around and all that stuff. They had already made this sequence, and it was so expensive to them that was the real practical reason for why the Salkinds wanted it moved to Superman 1. Because they're like, listen, we spent all this money. We're going to put it into the movie that we know is getting released. With Superman 2, they weren't sure what was going to happen yet. And they were kind of holding off the decisions on for that. Because if this film failed, they didn't know what this film was going to do. So they were trying to play it safe. And they were like, listen, if this film bombs, we have to make sure that everything we put into it at least shows up on the screen so it was worth it for something. Little did they know it would go on to be a huge smash success, and maybe they could have just stuck to the original plan and saved the time travel for the end of Superman 2. Never mind all that. But apparently it really was like budgetary concerns were essentially why that scene, which was intended for the end of 2 and was already shot with the hope of using it for the end of Superman 2, was suddenly moved to 1 so that the producers can justify having spent a ton of money on this sequence. They didn't want to have spent that money and then Superman tanks and no one even sees that thing that they spent all the money on. Which is what basically happened with Bryan Singer's Superman Returns, where they spent $10 million on the Return to Krypton, and we only ever saw it as an Easter egg on a DVD. It's interesting, and I've never had it explained to me that way, that really it was a budgetary concern having to do with how expensive the reversal of time sequence was. Did you know that? I didn't know that until very recently. And Essentially, after the release of Superman 1, the Salkinds completed their double cross of Richard Donner, because rather than bring him back to now complete the movie he had shot 75% of, they fired him. And they hired Richard Lester to come in and finish the film. And then, since the Directors Guild states you cannot be considered the director of a project unless you have shot at least 50% of it, Richard Lester couldn't just do the missing 25%. He had to go back and rework several of Donner's scenes and change some things around and put his flavor into stuff earlier in the story so that he could officially say he shot at least 50% of it and then get the director's credit. But ultimately, this ended Donner's run with Superman. And it's so sad because he would go on to say in later interviews that he had like 5 different Superman movies he wanted to make. And it's interesting to note that had he been able to finish Superman 2, he wanted to go into a Superman 3 featuring Brainiac. And he and Tom Mankiewicz were already approaching a way to write that story and to introduce Brainiac. And even beyond that, Tom Mankiewicz, the unsung hero from the first 2 movies, was actually going to direct Superman 3 or 4. That's right. Richard Donner has said that the plan for the 2 of them was to basically be developing these movies and to kind of be alternating. We're like, I'll direct 2, you direct 3, we'll work out 4, and we'll see who directs that one. And it was kind of like the 2 of them wanted Superman to be their baby for years. They had all these places that they would have loved to have gone with Christopher Reeve's Superman. And it's one of the sad the sad what ifs in Hollywood history of if you would have just let Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz cook, what kind of a Superman franchise could we have had? Because instead we got Superman 3, and you could tell maybe the Salkinds knew that Donner and Mankiewicz wanted to do Brainiac, so they invented their own supercomputer villain. Again, I don't know why the Salkinds were also so against actually going to the source material. You're developing a comic book character. Why not draw from the source material instead of having to Hollywood everything up and change the names and make it your own and all, God, I'm so glad we don't have to. The Hollywood of today is not like it was back then, where they were so self-conscious of just being true to the stories, being true to the source material. But yes, so they basically made their own bootleg Brainiac, and they brought back Richard Lester, and they hired Richard Pryor, and they made the goofy Superman 3 instead, which didn't have any of the heft and gravitas or pull on audiences that the Donner-Mankiewicz collaborations did. And then we know what happened with Superman 4, where, Richard Lester wasn't even involved with that one. The budget was terrible. Canon Films got the right. It was just, it's a mess. And yet, if the Donners and the Salkinds could have just gotten on the same page, we might have had Supermans 1 through 5 shepherded, written, directed entirely by the duo of Richard Donner and Tom Mankiewicz. And how amazing would that have been? And it's not just us fans who thought that the double cross was crazy, because I've always kind of admired the fact that both Gene Hackman and Marlon Brando, when this happened on Superman 2, where Donner was fired, they both basically said, well, then I'm not coming back. Good luck. I'm not working unless it's Richard Donner. And that's why when you look at the Richard Lester cut of Superman 2, all the Gene Hackman stuff was shot by Donner. And some of the later Lex Luthor stuff that we see at the end with Lex out by the Fortress of Solitude, that is a body double and a voice double. Someone trying to sound like Gene Hackman and someone trying to look like him from afar, because Mr. Hackman himself said, I am not coming back to reshoot this stuff unless Richard Donner is present. And Marlon Brando at the same time was saying he was mad at the Salkinds because they didn't pay him what they promised. They had promised a certain amount plus points on the back end, and they apparently squelched on their deal to Mr. Brando. And as such, he sued them. And that's why instead of seeing Marlon Brando in Superman 2, instead of seeing Jor-El in Superman 2, they went and got Susanna York, the woman who played his mother in the first scene of the first Superman. And they got some random guy to play a random Kryptonian scientist. All of this just to cover up for the fact that Marlon Brando was no longer going to be involved with the project. And it's just, I find that sort of just like poetic, and I'm grateful to Hackman and Brando for making the Salkinds' lives a little more difficult, because I honestly, to me, that's one of the original sins of Superman on film. The way Donner was unceremoniously fired from Superman 2, despite making the movie that is the blueprint for not just Superman on film, but for all of the comic book movies that have come since. That film inspired a legion. It inspired generations of filmmakers to tell these stories with a certain level of verisimilitude and a certain element of honest, emotional truthfulness. At a time when most people looked at this stuff as childish children's entertainment, Richard Donner's Superman the movie became the blueprint by which everything we see today is still measured in some way against that freaking movie. And if you want to hear me wax more philosophical on that, go back and check out episode 3 of this podcast, The Blueprint, Superman the Movie, where I talk a little further about other filmmakers who were inspired, the films that they made based on the Superman formula. And hope you, if you haven't yet, do check out Superman episode 3 of the Superman on Film podcast. But that pretty much does it for this week's topic. The original plans for Richard Donner's Superman 1, 2, and beyond. I would love to find out what all 5 of his movies would have been about. Right now, the only things I could really find are, we know what his Superman 1 and 2 would have been. We know 3 would have taken us towards Superman versus the supercomputer known as Brainiac. But we don't know what Superman's 4 and 5 might have been. And one needn't look forward. One needn't look further, I should say, than what Richard Donner did in the literary form of Superman years later, to see how much he cared for this character and what kind of stories he was ready to tell. Because many years later, Richard Donner did get a crack at telling some more Superman stories, but they were literary adaptations. He wrote a number of comic books alongside Jeff Johns, and they kind of centered on ideas of Superman having a son, which is funny because Superman Returns eventually went that way. Donner's influence, the things Donner wanted to do, even the things he discarded, inspired people to kind of continue in his footsteps. That should say something. But, yep. That does it for this week's topic. I hope you enjoyed episode 14 of the Superman on Film podcast. And actually, even though the topic is done, I got one more thing I want to tackle, because last week I did mention that there is a new email address I've set up. If you want to send questions or suggestions or anything to me, things you'd like me to discuss here on the show, you could send them to supermanonfilm@gmail.com. And already I've gotten an email from Mr. Eugene Tan. Hi, Eugene. I still remember all your messages and questions you would send me over at thefanboypodcast@gmail.com. But here's what Eugene sent me this time. He said, will Superman finally get the love and respect that he has been waiting for so many years? With James Gunn's Superman set to come out in July 2025, is this going to be the movie where the character Superman can finally get the love and respect that he has been waiting for so many years? Personally, I think that the Superman franchise deserves to have the same love and respect like the Spider-Man franchise, Batman franchise, John Wick franchise, and the Mission Impossible franchise currently have. Would like to hear your thoughts. Thanks, and keep up the great work. Well, thank you, Eugene. And look, I'm right there with you. I've been saying for freaking ever now But it's an outrage that Spider-Man and Batman have gotten a million opportunities to tell stories and be rebooted and recast, and they always seem to get all the time and attention that they deserve. But Superman has always just been treated like the red-headed stepchild ever since the Reeve days. That he's just been sort of languishing, really, because even mid-run on the Reeve days, the films kind of took a dive right after Superman 2. So we're looking at 40 plus years of mismanagement of Superman on the big screen. And we've watched a couple of splashy attempts to relaunch him into the heavens. And, in the form of Superman Returns and Man of Steel, and neither one managed to pull it off. So to answer your question, do I think that 2025 will be the year that Superman finally gets the love and respect he deserves? Yes. Yes. I feel like it's going to finally happen. I think based on his track record, what he was able to do with a band of misfits like the Guardians of the Galaxy, I feel like James has what it takes to tell a story that's going to make people all over the world fall in love with Superman again. And unlike his predecessors, James Gunn has zero qualms going to the source material. He actually seems to be proud of who Superman is, and he wants to tell his greatest literary stories and adapt all the different facets of what have made Superman a timeless, incredible character that has existed for 86 years so far. So with that in mind, Eugene, yes, I'm fairly confident. I'm fairly hopeful that this will finally be the thing that makes Superman cool again. I think it'll happen. I think he's going to get his love and respect. I can only hope. But either way, I'll be here to discuss, and hopefully some of you will come see James Gunn's Superman with me next year, July 12th, 2025. But until next week, life is chaos. Be kind. Up, up and away.